One of the most common messages that I receive from people is, I need help arranging music. I can come up with a couple simple ideas that I really like, but then I don't know how to develop them and take them further and actually finish a track. Well, like any type of overwhelm, this usually comes from just having too many options. I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a whole lot of music out there these days, and it's all put together in a variety of different ways. But how do we know what to do to get from point A to point B and actually finish the thing, develop that 4-bar loop that we really like into a finished idea? Today I'm just going to get straight to the point and give you 4 concepts, 4 ideas that changed the way that I think about putting music together and really helped clarify the entire process for me. And I'll give you some examples of how I actually apply them and have applied them over the past decade and a half that I've been making music. I recently watched an interview with director David Lynch in which he compared writing to fishing. He said all you can do is put the hook in the water and be patient. For a writer or a composer, this doesn't mean sitting around doing nothing waiting for inspiration to strike, but instead kind of patiently experimenting and trying different things. And during that process, which is actually work, you have to be doing things, you wait for the idea that you really like to latch on to your hook. And once you've reeled in that fish, you put it back on the hook and you throw it back in the water. And suddenly you find that you're starting to pull out a lot of fish that are related in some way to that initial fish that you caught. And soon you have a collection of somewhat related ideas that you can start to play around with. They all kind of feed off of each other and build off of one another. This is a great analogy because it's how any creative process works. Anytime that I stare at a blank page or project, I get overwhelmed and wonder how in the world I'm going to come up with something coherent that all works together. And I really just need to focus on getting that first idea, one strong idea that I find interesting and inspiring, and that serves as my jumping off point where I can take it and develop it in different ways. So the only way to get past that sense of overwhelm is just to put the hook in the water and start fishing. For us as artists, that means experimenting. Think of musical phrases like conversations. If we do that, it makes it a lot easier for our listener to understand what's going on because they can focus on 1 or 2 things at a time instead of everything happening all at once. It also makes them able to remember those things. When they can focus on them, they can remember them for later, which allows us the ability to bring those things back, repeat them, or vary them later in the development of the piece with a lot more impact because our listener actually remembers that idea. Think of your initial idea like a question. It might have an upward inflection at the end. Now we need some kind of an answer in response to that question that we posed. This gives us a good sense of resolution. And this period structure doesn't only apply to melodies. We can also apply this to our chord progressions. So here's a progression that might work underneath that melody that I just wrote. And I'll show you how to make this chord progression more interesting in a bit. This question and answer scheme gives us some sense of pattern, establishment of a pattern, and then contrast. And those are 2 incredibly powerful tools in music. Any repetition or establishment of a pattern legitimizes anything. So it doesn't matter how dissonant the chord progression might be or how dissonant the harmonic language might be that we're operating within, I can still establish a pattern so that the listener understands where I am. So even something non-functional and more dissonant can feel right by the way that we use it, the context. So we've already talked a bit about this with the question and answer thing. That's basically establishing a musical narrative. And we can also take our chord progression that we just developed and turn it into something more conversational and linear as well. And if we take this approach, this linear, horizontal approach, as opposed to always thinking in blocked verticals, we can then extract more out of it. So to hold to Mr. Lynch's analogy, more fish of the same kind will be attracted to this idea. We can pull more out of one strong chord progression. Pop music is built on blocked vertical chord progressions that jump from one to another and are fairly repetitive. I like to think maybe a bit more old school, where the linear parts, as they move along together, align to create the verticals, or the chords. We don't have to understand everything, every rule of part writing from back in the day and all the rules of counterpoint to understand how to use this, at least to some degree. This can be achieved by taking a simple blocked chord progression and redistributing the voices and using inversions. Basically just revoicing these chords in different ways so that we are considering how one note in the chord moves to the next note in the next chord. One way to make this melody and the chord progression feel more independent is to avoid doubling any notes that the melody might have with the chords underneath. Basically, this just means that I am enriching the harmony by not doubling. Doubling weakens the harmony as opposed to strengthening it like we might think of in orchestration. This can lead to a smoother sounding chord progression because each note in the chord is suddenly an independent part that has its own shape to it. So it almost becomes like an individual melody within the chord. So then we have this series of melodies that are all moving from left to right through the chord progression. I give more examples and more details on how to approach doing this in my free composition ebook that is down in the description below. Free download if you would like to check that out. There are also some other concepts that I've referenced in the past, all compiled there, that have helped me the most over the years. So now I have a series of parts, and when I have a series of interesting parts, I can extract those parts from the chord progression. So then I could do just 2 parts at a time. I could pull just 1 part out and use that as a descant over another chord progression somewhere else. There's just a lot more material to be mined from these chords now. More material that we can mine from these chords means more variation, more possibilities. And whenever we have more variation that's all created from the same source material, it all feels connected and coherent, and like we're doing more with less material, rather than always feeling like we have to cram more stuff in there. And that is what I'm going for. So, if we have some strong linear idea that is our main one good idea, and then we've written a chord progression that can accompany that and is linear so we can extract parts from it, we can start to mine this very rich material for more sections, more possibilities. We can create larger sections from these micro materials. And it all feels connected and coherent. And I would say, before you start trying to do experimental form and weird, crazy things like Beethoven blurring the lines of Sonata Allegro form, well, here's the thing. Beethoven understood Sonata Allegro form incredibly well and wrote a lot of traditional Sonata Allegro form before he started blurring the lines with other forms. So I think the lesson there is get really good at creating pattern and contrast and just those basic forms before you start trying to blur the lines and incorporate other things. And then you can experiment once you realize that music is a modular process. It's made up of smaller chunks that we can swap around, move around. All of that is done through experimentation and experience, and eventually taste when you figure out what you like the best. So just like an essay is made up of paragraphs, which are made up of sentences, which are made up of words, a piece of music is made up of smaller sections that we can experiment with. Music is modular. If you want to see more about how to write chord progressions in this linear style, I've done some videos on that in the past, including this one right here that you can check out if you'd like.